Hello and welcome to Stand in the Gap, where we consider the issues most affecting you, the American citizen, the American family, the American governmental system, and the American church. On this program, we don't just talk around the issues. We don't spend time shaping symptoms. We try to go to the root problem. And through the four-phase lens of a biblical worldview, which recognizes four essential truths, being these: there is God. There was a creation and act of God. There was a fall where sin entered the world, precipitated by the devil, but there is redemption secured by Jesus Christ. Analyzing these four, Pastor Isaac Crockett and I analyze and answer the most pressing cultural issues of the day from a biblical and constitutional perspective. We follow a simple approach to solving any and all problems facing our nation by applying a deliberate diagnostic process consisting of four clarifying questions. What does the Bible say, either in command or principle? What does the Constitution guarantee or prescribe? What does freedom require of you and me? And what does justice demand from civil authority? Now, our goal is not to be sensational or entertaining. To the contrary, our commitments to the truth, to integrity, and to the healing that comes only through the love of Jesus Christ and obedience to the Word of God. Now, we're not going to be unnecessarily complicated, but we will deal with profound ideas. We'll not be dogmatic either, except where the Bible or the Constitution is unchanging. And we won't tell you what to think, but we'll share what and how God thinks and how it has led us to think. So if you want to know the truth, if you want to know what God thinks, if you want to make sense of all of the nonsense around us, stay with us for the next 30 minutes as together we walk through the darkness of today's seemingly unsolvable dilemmas into the light and the freedom of moral truth. Now, the focus of today's program is the opioid crisis, destroying families and futures. You know, this issue is one of the most broad-based concerns affecting every level of society, every income strata, and equally entrapping people from every ethnic background. It's an issue that kills over 60,000 people every year and impacting not only individual lives, but entire families and communities extending to our entire nation. Millions of dollars are being spent trying to fix this obvious crisis, but have we really diagnosed the root problem and asked the right questions? Are we just going to spend billions of dollars like we have been doing for scores of years trying to get a handle on the drug trade only to find that it's now worse than ever? Well, in just a minute or two, Pastor Isaac Crockett and I will welcome a special guest, Joel Jakubowski. He's the Vice President for Business Development for the Pennsylvania Adult Teen Challenge located in Raresburg, Pennsylvania, to help us walk through this critical issue as we identify the root problem, how we got to where we are, and then present solutions that will actually work. But before we do that, let's watch just a short video of Attorney General Jeff Sessions in a recent press conference as he announced the commitment of the Trump administration to combat the opioid crisis.
Today, we are facing the deadliest drug crisis in American history. We've never, ever seen the death rates that we're having today. 64,000 died last year. Based on our data, the overdose rate continues upward. It would be the highest drug overdose death toll and the fastest increase in that death toll in American history. For Americans under the age of 50, drug overdoses are now the leading cause of death. This crisis is driven primarily by opioids, prescription pain medications, heroin, and synthetic drugs like fentanyl. Fortunately, President Trump has understood the gravity of the situation and has a great passion for this issue. He's taken rare steps on declaring a public health emergency and requested more than $1 billion in anti-opioid efforts in this new budget.
Now stay with us. We'll be right back to discuss this issue of the opioid crisis, destroying families and futures.
Truth, flexible or permanent? The Bible, ancient history, or powerfully relevant? Culture, a reflection of enlightenment or warning signs? The pastor, commentator, or frontline combatant? Every day, American Pastors Network speaks to these questions where and when they matter. With hundreds of affiliate radio stations nationwide, a website and mobile app screening today's headlines through the twin lenses of the Bible and the Constitution, and a growing network of statewide chapters leading the conversation in cities, small towns, and state capitals. Educating, informing, equipping. This is the American Pastors Network. The time is now to stand in the gap for truth.
Well, welcome back to Stand in the Gap. I'm Sam Rohrer, and Isaac Crockett to my left, and we are delving into a very, very critical topic, the opioid crisis, destroying families and futures. We're privileged to have with us a special guest today, Joel Jakubowski. He's the Vice President of the Pennsylvania Adult Teen Challenge Center, and we're privileged to have him. And Joel, you are involved in an issue with Teen Challenge as a ministry that really is in the heart of this. One of the things I've learned as we debate or to talk about any issue, the best thing to do is define the terms. Mm-hmm. So I want you to define for us just briefly. We call this opioid crisis, mm-hmm. but I've also used the word drugs.
Right.
What is the opioid? What is an opioid? Mm-hmm. What's a drug? Is there a difference? Define this if you could, please.
The primary differentiation that we want to look for here is the difference really between opioid and opiate. Both of those drugs will affect the opioid receptor in the brain. Both attach to the opioid receptor and then create that after effect. The opioid medicines, although they attach to the opioid receptor, they themselves are not derived from the opium plant or the poppy plant. They're not derived from opium. The opiates are derived from opium. That's the key difference between the two. In terms of drugs, what we say in our field is really drugs are drugs in terms of how they affect the rate of addiction. So then we go on to say that addiction is addiction is addiction.
Well, it's really frightening when we heard Attorney General Jeff Sessions, what he had to say on that video clip. Sam and I have actually talked with him about some of the issues going on, and he says this affects all strata of families. Mm-hmm. I have a brother-in-law who's a detective. He's an assistant chief of police near Rochester, New York, and he said that he's seen doctors, lawyers, all kinds of professional people addicted. As a social worker, I remember seeing just the families that foster, kids being put into foster care because of this. And as a pastor, I've seen it in my own life with people I've worked with. My dad, I remember him dealing with people. How big of an issue is this? I mean, we heard 64,000 people died.
Yeah.
What is the scope of this drug and this opioid problem?
Yeah, we're referring to it as an epidemic, and it really is. Each year in this country, about 174,000 are dying each year. So ultimately, that comes out to about 8 or 9 per hour in this country. And then Pennsylvania, importantly for us to know locally, is the 4th largest abuser of overdose death rate, according to this epidemic, and the effect it's had. And so for us, that means about every 2 hours somebody is dying from this epidemic by way of overdose. It's lowered the life expectancy for our nation. And so far, we're accumulating numbers that surpass the Vietnam War and all the combined years of Vietnam War, that death rate. We've exceeded that. And we've exceeded the height of the AIDS epidemic. So we truly are seeing, some would almost suggest that we're moving into a pandemic.
Wow. And so real quickly, how long has this kind of become the problem, the issue? Because I know we used to talk, just say no to drugs. There was marijuana, then it was crack and cocaine, different things. How long has opioids really been the big problem?
From a very medical perspective, what originally drew attention was in 2007, what we were finding is that there were more overdose death rates than there was by trauma. That was the first time we'd ever seen that in our nation. And so a lot of people started...
Can I ask you, what do you mean by that? Death rates by what?
Death by any traumatic circumstances that would happen in a natural fashion through the emergency rooms.
Okay.
Trauma deaths in general, in natural capacity, so to speak. But the overdose rates were exceeding that in our emergency rooms. And so that started to draw some attention, and obviously it indicated there was a greater issue because it was overdose related, and we could tie it back to what. And so some of the evidence seemed to suggest is what was happening is what had come onto the market in voracity was the opioid medicines and the opiate-based pain relief medicines. Now, these pharmaceutical companies were producing these at mass rate, and it turned into a $70 billion a year plus industry. Or not quite, a little less than that, but $1 billion industry. And so what ended up happening is that the demand for these drugs became exceedingly high because there was an actual addiction existing where it was originally created that it was not going to be an addictive medicine.
Right, so Joel, you're laying out very clearly, the problem is extensive. We've already talked about it's in every strata, it's everywhere. I know, Isaac, you have said that, it's in Christendom too, so it's not something that's isolated to outside the church.
Right.
It's inside the church as well. We've talked about problem, but I want to go a little bit further here and just define this a little bit. We said at the beginning of the program that we would define the root problem.
Yeah.
I know from being in office for a long time in public policy and so forth that most of the time, across the country, we spend billions of dollars trying to, in my opinion, shape symptoms, but never get to the root problem. So let's just talk about this issue of opioids. You've talked about addiction. There is a difference between the symptom. If I go to my doctor and he just gives me something for my headache, but my headache's being caused by a tumor,
Yeah, right.
I ultimately going to die.
Yeah.
So let's go to the root problem here. In your experience, what is the root, really the root problem that we're talking? Is it just addiction, bad as it is,
Right.
or is it much deeper than that?
It's much deeper. As time has gone by in our culture, we have really gone away from what we would call a biblical wraparound would be maybe God-dependent and self-disciplined. Well, we become very independent and self-reliant. And so as a result of that, we've found ourselves more and more gradually moving away from a dependency on God, and we're finding, and with affirmation culturally, that we can have great dependency on ourselves, and then an expectancy grows around that line of dependency that the culture reinforces. We see that starting to rear its head in terms of entitlement coming into our culture.
Well, that's interesting, and we don't have time to really go into the details of it, Joel, but a lot of people don't understand that we live in an independent culture. We pride ourselves as Americans to be independent. But in reality, we're dependent on something, either God or we're going to be dependent on something else.
Sure.
I've come up with an identification for a root problem. Tell me if you agree with this. I've described the opioid and drug-based issue as this. It's a broad-based physical and spiritual bondage resulting from a misdirected natural pursuit for peace or as an escape from pain.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that? Because as I've looked,
Yeah.
Joel, people seem to, we all want peace.
Yeah.
We all want security and a refuge and all of that kind of thing, and we can find a lot of different places, but I don't find that everybody who's become addicted has necessarily gone there because of they're evil necessarily.
Right.
Talk about that a little bit. Physical bondage, spiritual bondage.
Yeah, certainly. I totally agree with you. I think it's a very important thing that we have to be very cautious about, especially even as people of faith, is that we're not relegating people that find themselves addicted as the causation being bad people or moral failing in terms of being a bad person. Certainly the end result can be moral corruption, and I think it's okay to express that because once we're in that lifestyle, it does become exhaustively corrupt in terms of manipulation, lying, deceiving to meet the need. So there certainly becomes a physical dependency. Many who had no intention to move into an intentional desire to even maybe escape reality or escape the hurts of life or even to go into a place of idolatry find themselves prescribed. And many of these upstanding citizens and people of faith prescribed by a doctor, and then for whatever reason, we could say biological, sociological, spiritual, and psychological, and there's a number of reasons on why that person is for lack of a better word, predisposed for whatever reason to finding themselves addicted. Once the addiction comes in, certainly it becomes a bondage. You start to live in a lifestyle seeking completely a freedom from anything that might suggest discomfort. And so it begins to become perpetual and begins to become exhaustive. And eventually we find ourselves where maybe it started as the desire for that chemical, even if it was a willful choice, it ends up as a need. because we have a spiritual oppression, a emotional bankruptcy, and a neurobiological impairment.
Wow. And, Joel, you were talking about the word escape. Sam, you said that in your definition of this. You said earlier, feeling entitled, and so many people feel like they are entitled to a life without pain. If they experience a pain, the Bible says that God will make a way of escape for us through Him, but they try to find their own. Sam, what's going on with that? From a biblical perspective, a worldview here, what is the difference in their worldview that causes them to find this escape, as we've been referencing it as?
Well, Isaac, I think that's a great question, and that's why I posed it to Joel here, is that God has made every individual with what we'd call a God-shaped vacuum in our lives. He's made us to be dependent, I believe, on Him as the Creator. And that's a biblical worldview we talked with. There is God, there is a creation. God made man in His image, but He made man to worship God, to worship something.
Yes.
Right, Joel?
Yes, sir.
And to that extent, we have within us a natural bent towards serving, worshiping something. Well, God would have it that we'd worship Him, Isaac. And He says, worship me. If you do, then there are blessings. If you turn from me, then there are cursings. And I think as a result, the devil, that's where the devil comes in. That's the whole point of there was a fall precipitated by the devil. What did the devil do? The devil stepped in and said, hath God said to Eve? He tempted Eve and said, there's a better way. He tempted her. Well, that better way, I believe we see through life, is any form of idolatry. It can be opiates. It can be alcohol. It can be a host of other things that we worship more than God. And the devil is very, very good about enticing, and that's what we say here, it's a natural pursuit. I really believe it's a natural pursuit of wanting to know who God is and to worship Him, but we get sidetracked, and then we get stuck, and then we end up in bondage, which is the exact opposite of the freedom that we have, which is redemption procured by Jesus Christ. So it's a lie, basically, we have bought into. That's what it is, Isaac.
So we have this bondage versus freedom then. And Joel, you, as a pastor, we're all preachers here. As a pastor, what is this? How do we see the bondage part of it, and how versus God's freedom that He had given us?
Yeah, we found, like as we were saying earlier, we find ourselves in just a place of total depravity where we really become a stranger to ourselves and to God. When we're in the heat of our addictive lifestyle, if it goes to a place of true addiction and we begin to do all these things to meet that need, all that abandonment of a value system begins to occur. And when we find ourselves in a place where we've abandoned our value system, it becomes self-perpetuating. So the authentic man, the man who wants to have freedom, is constantly demanding from the inauthentic, the addicted self, to stop doing these things. Well, the addicted self, the job of that addicted self is to turn off that voice of reality and feeling. And so the more the addicted self hears the authentic self plead for help, the more the addicted self uses to not hear the voice, and it becomes this perpetual cycle, and we become stuck, terribly stuck.
Joel, you were talking about the definition of addiction.
Yeah.
That's a. I think you told me earlier. That's a behavioral change.
Yeah, very much.
That is controlled by something, whatever it may be. But you've also used the term spiritual bondage.
Yeah.
And we've talked about that too. Is it possible for someone who is dependent, controlled, addicted to whatever it is? We're talking about opioids today, or drugs, or it could be anything. Is it possible for someone who has an addiction, something that controls them, is it possible for them to have a clear mind spiritually to be able to hear what God is saying? There's a connection there. Explain that.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. The book of Hosea actually says alcohol. It says alcohol and prostitution, a life-controlling issue, the satiation of material things beyond God, creating an addiction. But it says clearly that alcohol has robbed my people of their brains. And so it reduces the ability to have a state of logical reasoning. When all day long we're hearing in our minds this great desire from the root of 1,000 different things, that really what addiction means is survival. The message to the brain is survive. Now keep in mind what the parentheses behind that would be then. If you don't use, then you die. So now we have a fear-based response. Fear, we could argue, perhaps is maybe the opposite of God. if we really boil it down. And so we have a very fear-based response that keeps us in the throes of this perpetual cycle of trying to meet that fear by using, which you know what it does, right? It creates more fear.
It absolutely does. And ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to Stand in the Gap today. Isaac Crockett and Sam Rohrer, our special guest Joel Jakubowski. When we come back right after this break, we're going to talk a little bit and actually ask Joel to share a little bit of his background, because the position from which he is speaking is from one of personal knowledge. And I think you'll find his story to be remarkable and very, very interesting and encouraging to you. Well, welcome back. We are spending our time today on the issue of the opioid crisis, destroying families and futures. And in this last portion of our program today, I want to go to our special guest, Joel Jakubowski. He's the Vice President for Development at Pennsylvania Adult Teen Challenge. Joel, you are in a position where, as a ministry, you are interfacing with, I would say, thousands, really,
Yes, sir.
truly, thousands of people that have become addicted to a number of certain things. And God has really given you, as a ministry, a tremendous impact and role. I've been in your facility. I've spoken there. I've gotten to know people, and I've seen many changed lives. But you have actually had a personal experience.
Yes, sir.
You've experienced some of these things. Could you just give us a little bit of a brief glimpse into your journey from bondage to spiritual freedom?
Yeah, absolutely. Not unlike many homes, there's really no perfect homes, but some have great levels of dysfunction. In my home, it was divorce and mental illness. And for me as a young child, it created a bunch of emotional dysregulation. There was no real strong faith direction in my family as well, which may have been super benefit. And so that emotional dysregulation ends up having even a boy reaching for what's going to create that regulation. And at one point for me, it became drugs and alcohol. Specifically, it began with marijuana. And it began to bring balance to that emotional dysregulation. Well, what began for 1 and 2 seasons of maybe casual usage, there's a point at which we find that despite our best effort to say, well, I'm not going to do that this weekend, or I'm not going to use Wednesday, or I'm not going to spend this money, something takes over, and it's undefinable for us at that point. And we realize that something is birthing in us that is greater than us. And it goes back to this expression of the spiritual oppression, the emotional bankruptcy, and certainly the neurobiological effect is taking place. And exactly as you said, Sam, where it started maybe as a desire, and as we said it previously, it really becomes a suggested need. And then it certainly becomes a great level of idolatry and bondage. And we find ourselves stuck. And so at some point we have to decide for ourselves, okay, I need to remove this lifestyle this function from my lifestyle, this drugs and alcohol usage. But for many, what we discover, and which really points to a lot of the low success rates in our culture for resolving this addiction issue, is we tend to focus on removal. And we leave this gaping void. And Sam, you said it best. Human beings are going to worship something, things or God. There's only 2 choices. And so what ends up happening is I remove the drugs and alcohol and I leave this gaping void, but there's no replacement. In a 30-day program, I do not have time for replacement. We can talk about it, but I can't go live it. Not really, and bring back the degree of deficit by replacement. And for many of us, we try to replace our drugs and alcohol with more created things, and we get a very limited result. So you can eke out a life of sobriety, but we believe that the replacement through Jesus Christ creates freedom. And we go from the underground of addiction to the level ground of treatment and ministry to the higher ground of a relationship with Jesus Christ. And it produces a sense of freedom, because that's the replacement. Christ shaped all.
Such an amazing, awesome testimony of what God did. Just to go back on that, you said you were quite young when, marijuana, for example. How old were you when you were first introduced, I guess, to drugs? And then what kind of was that enticement that led you into it?
Well, I was 8 years old. It was the 70s. And so, believe it or not, marijuana usage was not that uncommon. Certainly it was for maybe somebody my age, but it was prevalent. And I began to smoke marijuana, and then I didn't for a couple summers, but then I got to high school, and there were people in high school that were using, and I had experience with it. You know, it's very easy once you've slicked the slope to continue. You know, once you break the plane, it makes it very easy, the definition of temptation, right? Once we break that initial plane, it makes it very easy to compound. And then it became full-blown addiction to marijuana, and again, we begin to slick the slope, so we normalize our adversities and we normalize our abnormalities. So I began to minimize and justify and normalize the use of marijuana. So guess what happened next? Well, I'm going to go on to this drug. So I went on to cocaine, and it just keeps going. And there certainly all seem to settle on maybe a drug of choice. But at that point, all the days of where there may have been anything enjoyable about it are gone. And we're now truly in bondage, and it becomes a full-time job, just fighting off the demand of the addiction. The demand of addiction being 10 addicted Joels on the one authentic Joel that's now lost in the back seat, pleading for remorse and reprieve.
Joel, how long did it take you
Yeah.
to come to a point where you
Yeah.
realized
Yeah.
that you were really entrapped
Yeah.
and you needed help?
Yeah, I had gotten to a place in my life where, as I was saying earlier, I think I was get asked, you know, I tried to create all kinds of sanctions around it and could not, and started to realize it's bigger than me. And so, believe it or not, for many of us, what happens in that moment, because we have such a great fear and lack of confidence that we can be something else, is we resign to it. And I remember clearly resigning, and then realizing that breaking point, that what it had become was something that was not who I was destined to be. My family intervened, which was really a catalyst to this, and started to create all kinds of conditions for what was a healthy lifestyle versus a death style.
Joel, this is an amazing story. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not going to be able to complete this program today because we have yet to deal with the causes. How did we get to this place? And then, most importantly, the solutions. How do we get out of where the mess we're in? And I will tell you that there are answers. God's Word holds it. We're going to talk about that when we come back in the next program in part 2 of the Opioid Crisis, Destroying Families and the Future.